All right, everyone. My name's Anthony Costello, and welcome you again to the Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend a moral and just society. I'm joined today again by my colleagues Jacob, Logan, and Josh. And we spoke last time a little bit about the elections and some of the ensuing chaos with the challenges to the results. And we decided that in this next episode, we want to go back to the issue of COVID-19 and talk a little bit about the nature of the virus a little bit, some of the things we're hearing about vaccines, and of course, the responses that we've had this year to COVID, especially in the form of lockdowns, and maybe we'll even touch on the issue of mask wearing. So Jacob, let me start with you, as I think is now the norm. What's your take at your local church on just what's the attitude towards COVID, and especially, the being in California, some of the more stringent restrictions that we've seen this year on church congregating. And how are people processing that?
Yeah, one of the things about our church that I would say makes it slightly different from any other church is the whole idea of the plurality of elders. So even it's not just between the congregants that we have differences in terms of understanding the available facts and the facts that are made up and everything, but even within the elders, we have different views. Having said that, one of the things that I think in light of the COVID situation, the approach that our church has taken is that recognizing that we were not prepared for this. We were not prepared for a crisis like this. Having said that, how do we behave in light of that we were not prepared? Unlike any other churches that were mostly led by a senior pastor model where the congregants were just behind the shepherd as they were being led, and their hearts and minds were being prepared for eventualities like this. So the approach that we took was one of incrementalism, where everything, in light of the available facts, what we did was start everything. When it started, we shut down everything completely virtual, but as things start, it's realizing that, okay, facts are not available. People are kind of divided in terms of whatever facts were available stood for. We decided upon coming to a place of opening up different ministries, like youth ministry, women's Bible study, children's ministry, slowly on campus. So where we are today is we are meeting on a parking lot, and we are gathering. And blessing in disguise, if I may put it this way, and this is for all churches, is that how can we redeem this situation to get into a place of dialogue where we actually define terms? Because I think much of our differences come when we understand, like, what does it mean to be gathering? What does communion mean? What does baptism mean? And if we have different definitions we are working with, we will always be divided. But as leaders, what we are trying to do in our church is bring our congregants to this one definition of things, though we may have different ways of coming at it. But at least, and we do recognize that unity may not necessarily means uniformity. And that's what we are working with right now.
That's good. Early on, you said something about not being prepared. And I want to ask a follow-up question about that. Do you feel that the lack of preparation was in regards to a pandemic like this itself, like a very aggressive, rapidly spreading virus? And how do we react to something like a virus like this? Or was it to the restrictions that the government put on because of the virus? Maybe it's both.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was saying.
Certainly it's both.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to tease out here is, are we prepared for something like an aggressive illness that sort of sweeps through our communities, where, you know, maybe these days we aren't, where of course back in the 15th and 16th century, that was probably a much more common thing, right? So maybe people were prepared in the pre-modern age just to deal with sort of sickness and death, where we're just so reliant that we can kind of overcome anything like that with our technology, with our medical advances, with the kind of social structures that we have. And maybe we weren't prepared there. But then again, the government restrictions being a different kind of thing that maybe we weren't prepared for either.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So it's not that in terms of like, we have good theology, we have good philosophy, we have good understanding of our public presence, but we were never in a place where we had to apply this, really practice what we knew. And that's what I meant when I meant about preparation. It's not that we are not being taught or we are not being teaching, but
it's there in the abstract, in theory. It's there.
How do we translate that into now in our public behavior, in terms of how do we respond to all these restrictions, and how do we engage with even between the congregants? So having said this, I think when we are engaging with the culture and when we are engaging with the authorities, we need to also recognize that that's not the only aspect. That's not the only thing that unites us or can unite us if we all stand together in our response to the government. There are other factors in the church as well that should keep us together, though we may have differences. And that's the scary part about this whole thing. And I'm not talking about our church or anything, I'm talking in general, that people are so much focused on this one aspect right now, seeing everything through the lens of COVID, that we are not recognizing that we are a church that is united by Christ and his love, his grace. And those are the things that keeps us together while we may have differences. But what has happened now is that all because of these differences, and we are seeing everything through the lens of just one thing, we are keeping everything aside, and we are, in doing so, removing all civil dialogue, any platform for civil dialogue.
How different churches are reacting to COVID.
Yeah.
We're so focused on people making different decisions on that we're losing sight of the much greater reality that binds us together.
Exactly.
And we're just getting so focused on Pastor so-and-so did this, but Pastor X did this, Pastor Y did this. And we're just so focused on the disagreement that we're starting to lose our common ground, or at least lose sight of our common ground in Christ.
I would say so, yeah. In general, that's what I'm seeing. And that's a very dangerous place to be at for any church.
And that would be, one way where we could sort of, from a spiritual perspective, identify how the devil can use something like a natural evil to affect the health and vitality of God's church, right?
Yes. And this has happened, even in the past. Families been divided on the basis of their political allegiance, of what party they support. And so even with this whole COVID situation, this has happened even within the family. Families are divided, relationships are broken, and this is also been seen within the church. But I think we need to refocus. What is it that unites us together, binds us together, even though we may have differences when it comes to events like this?
Logan, in your church, in your experience in this past year, the reaction to COVID itself, just were we prepared for an aggressive virus and maybe seeing people in our community die in a seemingly untimely way, or at least get violently ill? And also, were we prepared to have the kind of governmental shutdown that occurred? And how did you see your church react?
I think the short answer is no, we weren't prepared. But I think that's the general consensus. And I think it's the consensus has been formed because it can cover a large variety of possible explanations, or in some cases just excuses if there were church difficulties already. So I know, for example, the church that I attend, we have a very wide and very deep differences, especially when it comes to our political beliefs. We have some very far left, some very far right. Those disagreements are already happening, and we're for the most part kind of playing behind the scenes, maybe on Facebook or in DMing, that kind of stuff. The church drama that generally happens, that was already going on. I think when you started seeing something like COVID happen, the behind the curtains kind of came out into the open, and you got to see people making very different reactions, and how that unfolded. You see people making the case, things that you thought were non-controversial, like, oh, we should love our neighbor. No one's really going to disagree with that. What became very controversial was how the left interprets loving your neighbor and how the right interprets loving your neighbor and what that looks like. For example, the argument was on the left, it seemed like, well, if you love your neighbor, you're going to stay home, you're going to wear masks, you're not going to go to your family Thanksgiving celebrations. They had a very strict view of what that looked like. And then the conservatives were like, no, if you love your neighbor, what about the person who can't be by themselves for long periods of time? What about those who do need to get out and have some sort of social interaction? Or, maybe there is some risk, that they're willing to carry on to try to have some sort of events, if it was with high school students or college students. So then this is where it kind of bubbled out into just straight conflict. And then some of the big church decisions that were being made, you could tell didn't make sense, because then they became just compromise decisions between, okay, here's what the far right's saying, here's far left, we do this, and then both sides didn't like it. And then that added more chaos and more disagreements. And then the next time, okay, we'll make this compromise, and then this compromise, and then at some point you could see that by and large there was a handful of grievances on both sides. And when I was talking to different pastors and stuff, you could tell they're like, well, we don't know necessarily, I'm not quoting them directly, but you could tell it was almost like, well, whatever we do, half the church is going to be upset, so we're going to try to do what we can live with, kind of, and hopefully at the end we'll get along.
Logan, so it sounds like to me we're saying there were all of these prior sort of political ways of thinking, right? Different ways of thinking politically, socially as well. And that when COVID struck, this was an occasion for these differences to sort of be made explicit, which reminds me of our previous discussion and some of the things that you pointed out about pastors, certainly not all pastors, but a sense that there are a lot of underlying significant differences that are not being addressed by pastors, church leaders from the pulpit. And they're there, but they're sort of avoided. They're not talked about. They tend to be connected to maybe political doctrines or ideas. And if we don't start addressing those directly, then when something like this happens, they just sort of explode on the scene, right? And then you got a big division. And you even said that, and I think Jacob agreed with you, and I probably would too, when that happens, then a lot of the pastors, some pastors at least, want to sort of sit back and sort of wait to see which faction wins out. And then they'll just sort of start steering the ship in that direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Josh, what's your take on this whole mess? Or maybe it's not as messy as we're making it, but it's still something that needs to be addressed, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm in a phase of transition between states. I was in Texas for a bit, then I moved to Arizona, and then I was actually just flew back from Nevada. I'm about to fly out to Texas again, and so because of that, I've been traveling to a lot of different churches and visiting a lot of different churches and in different states. And I think there's a wide variety, and you, maybe it's just because I'm going to all Protestant churches, right, versus like the Catholic Church, and there's no governing authority, but a wide variety of responses in the church to this, even within the same church. So for example, there was one church in Texas I went to where there's the announcers, and they're speaking on stage, and they'll mention make sure to wear your masks, but then another one will come up and say something that indicates his leanings are more conservative, and it's you don't need to wear your masks, and so it's so I think there's just so much I don't even know what the word is, I guess, differences of opinion, even intra-church and between churches. And so because of that, and I would agree with what Logan said, where I think there's there's very few churches who are just saying, this is our stance on it, this is what we're going to do, as the elder board or as leadership. Here's our outline of, or our beliefs on what we think is occurring in society, how we think we should respond to it, and how we would want you as our flock to respond to it as well. That whether it's a leftist response or a right-wing response, I'm seeing very little of that as far as just the general response of the church and of leadership in the church. So,
and we're not saying that that's an easy thing to do,
right?
Especially early on. Maybe now 9-10 months into it, some churches have had time to develop some kind of, the leadership. I mean, certainly early on, we would want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt that they didn't, just have some pre-prepared biblical, schemata ready to go when COVID strikes. This is exactly what we're going to do, right?
And
so we understand the complexity of the issue, right?
Yes. And that's the other thing I was going to say is I think like a couple months into it, right? Like if it was April, there was just so much still coming out that we didn't know. And even as even until today, there's new information being released all the time on how the virus works and different studies, and there's conflicting information. So I think we should definitely have grace for the churches and leadership, and how they're responding. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that there needs to be some kind of response. Instead of just saying, hey, the church leadership is just going to respond to what the body does. And so, yeah, I think there's just a lot of differing opinions, and there's a lot of chaos. And so what we need is unity, which again, like Jacob said, it doesn't mean uniformity.
Logan, we all have a sense that some of the disunity that we've seen over lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, the church not congregating but just going to live stream services, maybe wearing masks, and I'm still talking about just the church. We'll get to the broader society soon. But just again in the church, those differences, some of them may be connected to people's political leanings, but some might just be psychological, right? Yeah. I've been blessed. I'm 45 years old. I've been blessed. I've never really had a serious illness. I've never even had an injury. I think the only bone in my body I ever broke was my pinky, and that was my fault because I got in a fight in the Army and hit a guy in the back of the head. Might want to cut that part out. But there are people who they've suffered tremendously their whole lives, sometimes with all kinds of illnesses. They're just very prone to that. Their bodies are broken, and that is sort of the thorn in the side that God has given them to overcome. But clearly, somebody like that might be very more concerned, much more wary, much more sensitive to something like a virus that's spreading rapidly, right? Or people who work in the profession, who are in the hospitals, who are nursing. I haven't seen anybody die of COVID yet. So just those experiences alone would certainly be enough for some people to react very differently than other people who maybe have been, relatively healthy their whole lives, or who aren't equated directly with what COVID actually looks like. And that would be another factor we'd have to take into account as how, the difficulty for any pastor to lead a congregation through that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've, however, fallen into this view that we need an individual to make all the calls for everyone. At the end of the day, you're going to have a church that has so many different kinds of individuals going through all different kinds of things. And the hard questions are, well, how do you help each individual person in a way that best suits them?
Mhm.
And I would imagine a pastor would be well aware of this, but I'm not entirely convinced by how a lot of them have been acting, that you can't make a decision for another individual. So for example, if there is an individual in our church, I imagine there are plenty that are more sensitive to the virus. The question is, do you try to help that individual, or do you tell another individual, this is how you help them, you need to stay home? I think it's that second part that has created so much division. Wow, I was totally supporting of, let's do some live streaming for those who can't come to church, but let's not do live streaming and telling the people who would otherwise, maybe it's your situation or my situation, we have seems like a strong immune system and very much healthy, that we would attend a church, and instead telling them, well, we're going to have you guys stay home and you're going to have to live stream as well because these other people can't come. It would be unfair for you to show up at church and these people would have to stay at home. Well, that might be part of the burden the church has to take on, is those who can come should come in person. Those who can't, we're going to do these extra services to help accommodate you. Maybe just live stream the actual service. You don't have to do a separate service. But the idea of trying to help people according to their needs was totally, I think, trampled upon. And this is where, kind of how your question went was, well, how does one person help all people? I think the obvious answer is you can't. Mm-hmm. What you need to do is ask, how do you help your neighbor? And for some people, that means don't go over to their house. For others, it means you definitely need to go to their house. I've been aware of more people who've died from suicide than from the virus. Now, it's probably going to affect how I interpret it. But that probably is a reason why, is because I'm now in a position with a healthy immune system and being aware of that mental illness and how that's harming people. I can go out and help people. What's unhelpful is hearing pastors saying, oh, well, you shouldn't be going out because you're going to compromise other people. Well, hold on. Maybe for those people, they shouldn't be. But it becomes very difficult when you're trying to do a one-size-fits-all policy.
Logan, you mentioned about being divided even in understanding what it means to love our neighbors, and that's so much true. The only fact remains in both cases, regardless of how you understand how you need to be loving your neighbor, is that no one can basically impose or force you to love your neighbor, right? That's one thing remains, and I think that's where from the pulpit we need to be preparing our congregants to understand that love cannot be imposed on people or be demanded unless it's God. God commands us to love, but in our case, I think that's one thing that should bring both sides together. And in that case, I think I agree with you on this, that we have to consider both sides and be creative. I think that's what we need. We need more wisdom and be more creative in situations like this to accommodate both and bring them to a place of unity. Maybe not necessarily uniformity as it may happen.
Yeah, and what has confused me more, and maybe this is, maybe I have a little bit more of a scathing response on some of the choices, but it seems like a lot of these things aren't controversial. If I went up to a pastor, even if a pastor who I thought was far left and said, hey, I have a friend who's, because of lockdown, staying at home, is having, horrible mental illness problems, contemplation of suicide, I don't see a pastor like that saying, oh, don't go visit him. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that these extreme cases aren't controversial. The idea that you shouldn't be visiting immunocompromised individuals, no one would say, yeah, go visit them and risk getting them sick. Invite them all over for a Thanksgiving meal. But also the people who said, if I invited a bunch of people with mental illnesses that need to be with people and have that strong sense of community, they wouldn't be against it either. So I've just been confused at who are they trying to write these policies for? And I don't know if it's of them trying to be relevant, them trying to lead the way and say, hey, we're relevant because we're taking care of our neighbors in the best way we can do. I don't know why it's become so divisive, because the extreme cases aren't that divisive.
Well, Logan, and one of the things, and Jacob, remember when we had the panel discussion on this back in what was it, May, I believe? One of the things that I've been concerned about is an overemphasis, and it may just be in lieu of the fact that we live in a much more secular age, again, to reference Charles Taylor a little bit, where our physical existence seems primary, right? Not so much our eternal souls. Though that seems to be sort of more of an afterthought, where it's always seems to be a challenge of the church, especially in the modern era, to remind ourselves even that the goods of this earth are ultimately not our primary goods, right? The goods of our primary goods are eternal ones. They're transcendent goods. They're in heaven with God. But living in such a secularized age, it can seem as if the body is all that matters, right? And that our fundamental telos or goal is just to extend physical existence, sort of as long as possible and through whatever means possible. But the church, that's where I fear the church has to resist that kind of thinking somehow, and has to be clear about that. And I saw some of that over the summer, especially I think it was even watching a video with the agnostic author Tom Holland, who was pointing to this, who was sort of decrying the response of the church in England as being little more than a social service, just like any hospital or sort of health agency, but not really doing the work of pointing not just the believers, but the culture to goods that lie beyond, that lie beyond just what we can get in the here and now. And again, that's a difficult task. That's a difficult task in general. But it seems to me when something like this strikes, there has to be some visible demonstration of what, while we don't want to be foolish or irresponsible in our in how we act and behave while a virus is going around, we also can't let the idea that a virus could kill us dominate our lives, because in some real sense, that's a lack of faith in what we say we believe. Jacob, what do you think about that? That was my assessment, general assessment on some of the COVID issues this summer. What do you think on that?
I agree with you, Tony, and we need to actually live our current reality in light of eternity, and we fail to do that time and again. I think we get this sense that we are in control, and what has happened currently with this whole COVID situation is that our reliance on the promises of science, which has failed to come to pass, and we have seen that even in the scientific world, people are divided on this whole issue of COVID. So what it has done is actually the reliance that people had on the fact that we can actually extend our life and have a better physical life and be away from all these crises that we are encountering. I think when it was not delivered, what happened was actually it brought about a lot of fear. And I think the key issue at this point of time, regardless of what side you are on, is the question of how do you engage with fear? And I think the only way as a Christian I'm called to engage with fear is to live in light of resurrection. We are called to be the children of resurrection. And I think that theology and theology of understanding our death, that needs to be preached. That needs to be, that's something we need to be engaging with. So when we are encountered with a crisis like this, we are not losing our hope, but we are living a life that is hopeful, not just for ourselves, but we actually spread that hope around us without putting too much reliance. I'm not saying that we need to be Luddite and just leave everything and just run away and isolate ourselves and be monastic. No, we're not called to do that. We are called to be in the world, but not of it. And need to be living in light of that. And I think too much of our being in the world and forgetting that we are embodied beings, we are not just physical being, but we also spiritual beings, and they both are necessary and important. But we have to be living in light of eternity. I think missing that can do a lot of damage, and it is already doing it.
Josh, you're the healthiest guy of all of us here, obviously. But one of the things that I was saying to my men's group over the summer as we went to Zoom for a while, but then started recongregating again here at my home, was, as Christians, we have to not be as concerned about when we die as opposed to how we die, right? What have you seen? What are your thoughts on, have we overemphasized the physicality of our existence to the detriment of the transcendent, the spiritual? I mean, it's always a balancing act, we know, but what's your feeling?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think your worldview when it comes to the afterlife, when it comes to the immaterial versus material, that's going to play a major role as far as how you think we should respond. Because if there is no afterlife, right? If there is no heaven and hell, and we all just end up in the dirt, and we take this more of an enlightenment view or an atheistic worldview, then.
Although we have seen atheists resist this as well, right? There are atheists are like, this is crap,
reasons,
whatever.
But
yeah,
right. And I guess my point is that if you have a materialistic worldview, then there's nothing wrong with saying let's extend physical life at all costs. If there's any meaning at all on a materialistic worldview, I guess it would be found in life rather than in death, right? Because you're not existing at all in death, so it can't be there. And so what better than just to prolong the little bit we can try to cling on to. But as Christians, as we well know, we don't have that worldview. We believe in eternity, and so when you look at things like I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I might have the name wrong.
Yeah,
right. Maslow's, yeah. So when you look at the hierarchy of needs, the foundation and all throughout, you don't see any spiritual need. You don't see our need for a savior. You don't see the that's not in there. And that is our foundation. If I was to die tomorrow, and I didn't have that on a Christian worldview, I'm doomed. I'm absolutely doomed. So I think while health and I don't think it needs to be a black and white issue either. I don't think we need to say, well, because we have these this eternity in mind, and spiritual concerns, we can just completely ignore the body and I think the church actually has unfortunately a little bit of a history of doing that. And so I think it is important to recognize our health as well. But so all that to say, like, I think that and let's I guess make this concrete, right? First of all, what's being applied and how are we responding to it? So if there's church lockdowns, for example, like in California, it's a lot more severe, right? Is it something that where we should fall in line with that, and we should just completely not even gather together? So then you have to compare different values that we hold at church. Like, okay, here's physical health, but then here's also community and the body of Christ coming together, and how do these match up? And so I think the virus is creating unique challenges that the church has to face and say, what do we prioritize? And I would say that there's a quote I shared earlier. I'll paraphrase it. I might hack it up, but by Ben Franklin, that says, actually, I'll just pull it up and read it. I think that's probably more ideal. So it says, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And I'm sure this has been quoted a lot with what's going on.
In your face, right?
Yeah. And it's
man who is not the most Christian of men per se. He might have been in eternal goods. We don't know. It's a little ambiguous with him.
Right. But that's just one value, for example, is personal freedom. And weighing the cost of, are we giving this up in order to try to preserve life? And then also questioning what exactly is the threat of COVID, because even there's massive disagreement among right-wing and left-wing people in terms of, how much of a threat is the virus? Are these numbers that are coming out by the CDC reliable? And so I think you also even have to question some of the presuppositions that we're taking.
Or even if they were totally reliable, as low as the death rates are, what do you do? I mean, now I think the death rate is at like 1.8%. You know, it's going down, 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 the more cases they find. And I don't understand statistics very well, but it's getting lower and lower. You know, at what point does this not set a precedent for all kinds of things where there might be some small, you know, percentage of people who could die from, you know, activity X, Y, or Z? Do we do this for every flu season? You know, people have talked about, should we reduce the speed limits on all the highways? Anyways, but before we talk about maybe that kind of fear, because that would be operating out of a place of fear, right? Which once we start operating out of a place of fear, that's a very bad place to be making your moral decisions from, you know, right?
Yeah, and I just want to, I mean, I do want to comment on that, Tony, real quick, before you move into the next segment. I think part of the issue, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be, you know, two truths can be both. Two things can be true at the same time. It can be true that COVID is a legitimate disease and is infecting people and killing people, and it can also be true that the current restrictions, or some of the current restrictions, are not conducive to the flourishing of the church and to society at large.
Right.
I think we can hold both those things at true at the same time. And so, for example, I think one complaint, and you see this with John MacArthur's church, is while the restrictions aren't even being imposed fairly, they're not being. It seems arbitrary that, you know, you can say on one end that a bar or a nightclub can open up,
or Home Depot, or whatever, you know, whatever,
or Home Depot, or what have you.
Yeah.
But we don't have the right to religious freedom, which I would say the founding fathers would say is an essential right.
Well,
it is essential,
yeah.
Right? And so those kinds of things.
And Logan, we just had a Supreme Court ruling on this, didn't we? A 5-4 ruling. So it wasn't like 9-zip, right? Which, you know, of course, I want to say something here about the last three nominations and why they do matter at this point. But okay, so let me ask you two questions here, Lo. One would be, okay, we have to somehow make the argument, hey, church is an essential freedom. It's an essential good, right? And not just church, right? This would apply to all religious institutions, church, mosque, synagogue, temple, whatever, right? So now we can broaden this out a little bit, religious freedom. But also, and I did want to come back to, because Josh brought in some of the worldview issues. Hey, I've seen some atheists like Douglas Murray arguing against this stuff far better than any Christian. And I don't think some of those guys believe that there are anything as eternal rewards. So there is also this sense of, look, even if you believe there are no spiritual goods to be had, this is your only life. Well, you're not going to want to spend that life locked up in the four walls of your home. People need, we have common goods that are common to all of us. Well, we would say the spiritual goods are common to all of us, and some are just rejecting those goods. But conceptually, at least, there are goods that are common to the religious believer, the atheist, materialist. So one question is church essential? Is worship essential? Is congregating essential? And the other is, well, but what about how these restrictions are affecting people who don't believe in the spiritual goods anyways? Is it fair to them?
So there are a few ways that you can respond to that question, Tony, a few ways in which that can be hashed out. I'll begin by just reading through the amendment because it connects, I think, the different concepts. We tend to just isolate freedom of religion from the other ones. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, what many people will do is they'll just look at, well, obviously, freedom of the press. We need that. But they don't see that it's this collection of I guess, rights that need to be protected that are very similar in nature. These could be things that are religious or deeply held opinions. These could be the freedom of the press to print and disseminate information, the right to peaceably assemble if it's clubs or associations by which opinions can be propagated, or to voice grievances to the government. Opinions about the government may not appreciate. And I was reading through an essay by John Stuart Mill. Again, this is not an individual that you would consult for his Christian beliefs, on his essay on liberty, in which he provides a defense of the freedom of the press, which essentially boils down to the price of producing the wise citizen through contending in the public square is much greater in value than the fools they have to beat to get those opinions known. Essentially what he's saying is the differences, the conflicts, the fighting, all that sort of stuff that tends to emerge in the public square and produces one or two right opinions is great enough to allow for all of this, all these other opinions that we would say are wrong. He goes on to make the case that how we come to make opinions, the lack of certainty that's just inherent in even true opinions, things that we've come to accept as fact, we tend to override through, again, the freedom of the press or freedom of association, freedom of religion. And so the idea that you can't, so I guess the first response is there's no easy way to break apart freedom of religion and freedom of press, because fundamentally they're going to be, if you want to put them down in the realm of opinion, more arbitrary lines than anything that's natural and progressive. It's not like, oh, well, these are considered freedom of the press and this is considered religious opinion. There's no clear distinction on that until you've already just barred those freedoms to assert here's what constitutes religious. But I think what's becoming the big issue, and this is something that you'll see, I think, the common debating, and this goes back to what Joshua was talking about as far as the dysfunction in the church. It comes down to it comes down to who made the agreement. Did society make the agreement? Do we make the agreement? Do we have to live with those consequences if we didn't make the agreement? So look at the virus. Most people will say, well, is having a Thanksgiving meal worth killing people, right? They're going to say something like this. You're going to pass the virus around and kill a bunch of people. Was it worth it? Well, if you go down that route, that kind of route, it's something like this. Well, I didn't agree to go to the Thanksgiving meal. I think a Washington Post just ran an article on this. Oh, all these people didn't agree to go to the wedding, or all these people didn't agree to go to this celebration, but they got sick and ended up dying. Well, the same thing ends up making the case if you ask about cars. Is having a car worth it to go to the grocery store? I mean, how many people die per year from car accidents? That person didn't agree. He didn't own a car and you ran him over. Still, was it worth it, right? So you can see the fruits of this question of, well, society has made agreements before you were born. Before any of us are alive, we said the car was worth it. I mean, we might not have cashed it out in those terms, but we basically said auto accidents are traumatic, but worth it for what they give us. Globalization, as much as virus, we knew about globalized viruses. It wasn't something new. But with someone down the line or a group of nations said, but it's worth it. And now we're saying, oh, we don't like it anymore. And so you can't really rewrite these agreements, or we weren't there to make these agreements. And so this is where you're now seeing this sort of big question of like, how far does individualism go? How much are you just kind of in it with society? What are some consequences that you might have to endure that you weren't part of? I was out in Utah. I didn't realize this. I was talking to him over dinner with one of the business owners, and I was talking to him about why there was such huge distrust of government, especially in Utah. Here in Texas, because of their, the Alamo, you got the Texas thing. I said, what about Utah? I don't hear it. Is it the Mormon thing? And he said, actually, it's not the Mormons and the government. He's like, it's the nuclear testing that went down one state below us. We got a lot of that radiation exposure, and now there's this huge government fund to help pay back the damages that were health damages that we had to live through. Still today are affected by this question of who made the agreement and are we going to have to deal with those consequences, I think is one of the big moral issues that we really don't want to address. That we make these decisions and we have to live with the consequences. And atheists and Christians alike see this. It's not
that's not
a religious
to
necessarily.
a religious group or worldview.
Yeah,
for sure. Jacob, obviously we all believe that church is essential. Actually, I just saw an article, and maybe we can link to it, showing some empirical studies, showing how religious communities, especially I think particularly Christian communities, church-going communities, people have maintained some kind of church life, have fared far better with their mental health than those who have not or do not. So there's even sort of, empirical data that's going to support our claim that, congregating as a church is not only essential and it's like a common human good. It helps us psychologically, sociologically. Well, let's get back to the theological question. Is there a church? I mean, in one sense, yes, the church exists regardless of whether or not we get together physically. But there's also a reading of what the church is, that the church is always a local congregating of people practicing a common faith. At what point do churches say, if we don't do that, we're not really being faithful to how God has designed his church to be, right? At what point do we feel like we are actually leaving sort of the will of God and not doing what we are faithfully called to do?
Good question, Tony. And the very term ecclesia comes from the root, the gathered ones, the ones who gather together for a purpose. And one of the ways we need to look at church and our church gathering is not at we shouldn't be dissecting ourselves from the Old Testament understanding of gathering and coming together to worship God, in the midst of whom God appears and reveals himself or manifests himself. With regards to church, one of the things we should be asking is that, because we always look to the scripture and the first century church as to how they were in light of the crisis that they were under or persecution they were under. And the argument comes that they had house gatherings, they gathered together in houses and they worship, which is good. And my question is that normative or is that descriptive? Can we take that as a norm? They also gathered in temples. But the aspect of physical gathering, I think, is vital to a church. That what physical gathering offers cannot be, we can't take it lightly. We can't expend it, for anything else. Having said that, just like an NFL player who may not be on the field playing remains an NFL player, right? But doesn't mean that he can always stay away from the ground. He should be playing with the team, in the team, and they should be playing together. And so even with churches, there might be a moment or certain time when you may not have a leadership available in the church. Doesn't mean that the church ceases to exist, but that's not a norm that you can't have leadership. You have to have leadership that is established as per the scripture, as it mandates us to. So likewise, I think the existence of church is not in question. What is in question is, what is it that we aim at? And that's why this idea of incrementalism that I was talking about, coming to a point that we are not going to go back to a place where we are not gathering at all, but we are heading to a place where we will long for us to be together, physically worshiping and doing all that God is calling us to. One thing that I would say when it comes to the essentiality of the church is this, that I think there is a need for us to also understand that the secular world is not going to recognize church as essential as we do. Our task is to have a prophetic voice in the culture to make that obvious to people outside. when we're talking about other essential, businesses and things like that, there are economic reasons behind that as well. And I would also say that as Christians, we need not to argue that the church is as essential as opening up a mall. We can go to mall, we can choose to do that, but we can't do that with church. We have a mandate to be in the church as gathered people. We are called to, commanded to gather. So it's essential, but it's a different kind of essential. Has more authority, more moral value for us to gather together, and the good that it does. And what is needed is, in our context today, is to have that prophetic voice and make it available that people may know. Even you mentioned about the statistics that has come out. And I think if that comes out, people recognizes the importance of church and the role it plays in the solidarity of people together, and their mental health, their physical needs, their economic needs, whatever it may be. That has to be out there. People have to recognize that, and this is a moment given for us to actually take that opportunity.
Josh, what do you think? How might this crisis have helped us as a church? I mean, maybe have we gained some things that maybe we had neglected or lost? Have we been pushed a little harder to maybe dig into our own devotional lives, to have to sort of not just be a Sunday churchgoer, but also be more responsible for our day-to-day engagement with our faith? I mean, what do you think? What have you seen?
Yeah,
have you changed your own practices at all in light of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I love that. I think there's several. I think one that just stands out on top of my mind is the technological creativity that's occurred as a result of this. So another platform for people to be able to gather together in a sense, right, where otherwise they wouldn't be able to. So I think the ability to, for example, connect through Zoom or whatever platform that they're on, through some kind of video channel, and to be able to speak and gather that way, for Bible not just main congregations, but for Bible studies and small groups and all sorts of gatherings. I think that's really helpful. I actually ran into one woman when I was in Texas who I think she was going through dialysis, and she was basically home. She had to be at home. She was bedridden, and she was incredibly grateful for that, because it gave her the ability to connect with the body of believers where otherwise she wouldn't be able to. So I think there's some things that are coming out of this that were already occurring, but where we've given more avenues and more of an ability to connect with others. So that's one that jumps out the top of my mind. I also think just because something's negative doesn't mean it's not good. So I think there are some negative things occurring, like, for example, just some exposing of maybe underlying disagreements that were already there within the church on how to handle things that are being brought up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that it's giving the church an opportunity to address those disagreements, and therefore the ability to come together in diversity but still be unified. And I think that's incredibly important. Yes. So those would be just a couple of things that come to mind as far as how God has used this. And I think God has just used the COVID in general for his glory. I think there's people that are coming to Christ because of there's one person who's coming to mind, even as I'm thinking about this. Sean, I don't know, have you guys heard of Sean Foyt? I think that's how you say it. So they made an article about him. It's called Jesus Christ Super Spreader. And the intention behind the name of it was he's spreading COVID through these worship festivals that he's having in the midst of this crisis, because he's refused to to let COVID dictate coming together. And he's someone who's taken strong stance and said, no, we're going to worship God in the midst of this, and we're going to gather. And so they gave him that name, and he ran with it. He said, he's like, that's perfect. I'm a Jesus Christ super spreader. But obviously with the different intention that of what they had to what they meant behind the word. So anyways, I think there's lots of things happening. There's baptisms occurring in the midst of this. God can use any circumstance, as we well know, to bring people to him. And so our part is just how we respond, and as a church and as individuals.
Logan, Josh mentioned some of the good things that are happening in the midst of the chaos. Jacob, I know you've been talking a lot about people that who are coming to Christ, maybe because of some of the pressure of COVID. Even I've heard some very tragic stories. Story of one of the guys in my men's group is a hospital chaplain, and he prayed a woman through her dying breaths where the woman's family could not be in the room at the same time. When you hear things like that, those are the kinds of things that I really struggle to think are not just terrible injustices. But he also said at the same time that the family was incredibly strong Christian family, and they prayed in the hallway the whole way through, and there was joy. So God seems to work through even these tremendous instances of suffering and even injustice. How have you seen maybe some of your church or your community grow stronger in this time? This was for Logan. And then Jacob will ask you the same.
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. The first one is I've seen for those who have continued to gather, the kind of community that has developed has been more so than I think any of the church community prior to COVID, once it was sort of for what it was worth. It was a handful of us continued to gather, and the community that has built up from that has been incredible for the individuals, for myself, for the families also that have been involved. The other one is because a lot of us been at home, Zoom has become more of an option to be able to use, and as we're using now, for example, being able to even do the equal justice stuff. But I have some friends in Texas, some throughout California that now have the time to sit down and do readings through Shelby Steele or D'Angelo, or we're going to look at possibly some other books, if it's Thomas Sowell's work or maybe Coates, or there's a couple books you've recommended in the past as well, Tony, that we're able to jump on once a week and be like, let's go through the CRT stuff. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to do this. One of my friends particularly, she does a lot of event coordinating. She would have been slammed. Now she's doing some Zoom stuff, so she's like, well, I'm already on, I might as well do some reading and jump on and see what you guys are up to. So it's provided for those who continue to gather a really great in-person community, and even for those who can't gather because of distance, the Zoom, being familiar with Zoom has allowed us to connect in ways that we normally couldn't have. Yeah. And this is all within the church.
So who is speaking?
All right, Jacob. So, okay. How have you, what have you seen God do in this time of COVID?
I think definitely, as you said, Tony, people are recognizing the importance of giving all and everything in the hands of God. That's there too. I mean, though there is fear and uncertainties around us, but at the same time, within the church, what I'm seeing is that people are trying to be as creative as possible. I know that there might be churches who people may not be able to gather together as a church, but they can always open their houses. They can always open their houses for people and invite them to fellowship with them. And God does work through that. I've seen that in our own personal life, where we've seen people coming to faith, even stories of people accepting the gospel and Christ in their life. And So I always recommend people that we also need to open our houses while we want to open our churches. It's not either or, we have to have both. That would be the ideal place to be at. Also, we need to see as a church, I think one thing that God has done through this whole COVID situation is also to help us understand why is it important for us to relate with the global church as well. You know, meeting on our parking lot outside, what we call as uncomfortable, is the norm for majority of the world. They find that to be comfortable to gather together, to sit on the ground sometimes, or bring their own chairs and gather together. And so relating with the global church, and also personally, I'm seeing that a lot of people in the church are recognizing the importance of engaging with culture. And I'm really optimistic about this, that going forward, a lot of people will want to be proactive. And I hope that doesn't mean that they would see culture above the gospel. No, but that gospel is culture, and work with that framework to bring about truth, informing all aspects of life. So those three things I would say I'm definitely seeing God doing. And even in all this, it had been one of the busiest seasons for us in terms of ministry. They've been greater reach, as Josh, you mentioned, the very privilege of having internet and online services, and to be able to reach more people and engage with them. So we've definitely, though there've been so much of negative around us, we are grateful for the positive that God has brought even through this.
Right. Well, that's great. And, you know, what I don't know if I'm referencing the Roman author who was writing about the Christians, or Tertullian himself, that, you know, the Christians became known through the way that they showed their love, right?
Yes.
And I think we could also say the Christians could be known by the way we show our joy, you know, in the midst of suffering, which of course is just one aspect of love. Anyways, one of the privileges I had, and I'm going to tread on thin ice here, and this is my segue into our next episode on critical race theory, because one of the privileges I had over the summer was teaching through C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. And I say I'm treading on thin ice, of course, because Lewis was a white heterosexual male, and we know that we have to be careful as to how we approach the ideas of such men. But that's a joke.
And an English man too.
Right, nevertheless, colonialist. But just to prep us for next week's discussion. But you know, in teaching through Screwtape, you know, right in the middle of COVID, when most things were on lockdown, with my small group, where Lewis points out that the patient, who is the Christian man, you know, the junior devil, right, Wormwood, wants to kill the guy. He wants the guy to get killed in the middle of the bombing raids. He thinks that would be great. And of course, Screwtape, the older, wiser devil's like, what are you crazy? If you kill him now, he's going to heaven, right? He's in the middle of now, of course, Lewis has a more, you know, Arminian kind of view on free will and everything. But, you know, if you kill him now, it's game over for us. You know, the killing of his body is not our goal. It's the killing of it's the eternal, like, taking of his soul that we want. Like, what you want is the guy to live this really long life and go through these stages of, you know, getting apathetic about his faith, and then just getting tired of life and getting bored, you know, wear him out over time. Let him live to be 100 years old. And of course, as we know in the story, and it's done very subtly, but the man dies. He does get hit with a bomb in the middle of the London bombing raid, in the middle of helping give medical aid to people in the streets, right? So at the height of his expressing his Christian, acting on his Christian faith and virtue, is when he gets killed. And then Lewis has the beautiful scene of, you know, the spiritual reality being unveiled before him, and now he realizes what it was all about. And I think it was a beautiful thing to be able to teach through that book. Lewis is writing it in the middle of the London bombings, the heart of World War II. And to teach through that during something like COVID was encouraging to me and my students. And I think that kept us focused as well on, again, this idea of it's not when we die, it's how we die that's going to matter to the Christian. Well, look, this has been, again, a great episode. I want to thank everybody for joining us who's going to watch this. And we will be back together again soon to talk about critical race theory in the church and some new developments there. Thank you, everybody.